All right, so welcome back to the Young Idealist in my ongoing series on classical German philosophy and post-Kantian thought. And today we're heading over to Japan to speak with a good friend of mine and a wonderful scholar, Dr. Fernando Wirtz, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at the Graduate School of Letters at the Kyoto University. He's also the author of Phänomenologie der Angst, which is a fantastic book. Thank you for sending this to me. I read it and loved it. And I'm so happy to have you here today to talk about Kiyoshi Miki. And thank you again for being part of this series.
No, thank you for inviting me. It's an honor. I'm also a big fan of the podcast. So yeah, I'm very glad to be here.
Well, I'm glad you're here too, because this is going to be fantastic. So, who was Kiyoshi Miki, and what makes his philosophy important for all of us today?
Right. Yeah, thank you. Miki was born in a very particular time in Japan because it was a time of modernization and you could say a time of violent, in some sense, modernization and westernization. Actually, he was born in December of 1896, but he was registered in January 1897. Anyway, he was born in the transition in the last years of the so-called Meiji era in Japan, and the Meiji era is probably the time when Japan, so to say, opened to the world. So up to that point, Japan was mainly having some kind of exchange, economical exchange with the Netherlands, and in the Meiji Revolution or Meiji Restoration from 1868. Japan comes, so to say, in contact with the rest of the world and then also in contact with Western philosophy, what we will say the European tradition of philosophy, right? So Miki was born at the end of the 19th century. So he experiences this transition. I mean, at least from a Japan that was very closely in related to the East Asian environment, let's say, and the tradition of Confucianism and Buddhism and so on. And then all this literature, all this philosophy starts to come, right? So there are a lot of debates about, okay, what is philosophy? What is this thing that the Europeans call philosophy and so on? But Japanese scholars start to read Western philosophy intensively. They start to translate Western philosophy intensively. So this thing emerges in Japan as a kind of discipline. Miki was born in this context, and then he was very brilliant. He was a brilliant kid. He was born in a small village, which is now Suno City. It's near, it's in Hyogo. It's kind of far from Tokyo, but Miki goes to the high school in Tokyo, to a very prestigious high school. So he was very talented, so to say. And in 1916, he has this encounter with a book, which is the book by Nishida Kitarō, Inquiry into the Good, right? Inquiry into the Good, or Sen no Kenkyu, is a book from 1911. It's the first book that Nishida publishes. I will say something about Nishida in a second. Miki reads this book as a teenager and is absolutely fascinated by it. And he decides, I have to go to Kyoto, I have to go to Kyoto University to study with Nishida. And this was something that many people from his generation also experienced, right? Like many people encounters this book and they moved to Kyoto to study with Nishida. So it is a very powerful book. Miki studies at Kyoto University with Nishida. Eventually, he also goes to Germany. I think we want to talk about that later because it's a very important part of his life. He goes to Europe, he goes to Germany and France. He studies with Heidegger. Then he comes back to Japan. He will have some troubles with the police because he was a sympathizer of Marxism. In fact, he goes to prison for a short period of time. Then he is banned from the university, from the academia, and then he works as a kind of journalist, editor. He does this till the end of the war and will be again persecuted by the police, and then he will die in prison again. Time of militarism in Japan, it was a time of ideological control. And this was also the destiny of the fate of many leftist intellectuals in the 30s. Anyway, so Miki is interesting for many reasons. So first, he's one of the protagonists of this very active period of Japanese philosophy when philosophy starts to be intensively translated, studied, and also because we have these new currents in Europe that come to Japan: phenomenology, existentialism, Marxism. And so this is a very prolific time to be a philosopher. It was also historically very dramatic years of war and so on. So Miki's there, and Miki, one of the interesting aspects of Miki is that he is always kind of engaged intellectual. So Miki always writes that philosophy is not just about contemplation, right? It's about engaging in the world. This is something that it's quite clear in the philosophy of Miki is a practical philosophy. An aspect of his biography, which is during the last years of his life, around 1937, Miki also comes very closer to the official ideology, let's say, of the government of that time, and that was a militarist government. Especially, he was close to the Prime Minister Konoe Fumimaro, and Miki participates in a kind of think tank called the Showa Kenkyukai, so the Showa Research Association or Showa Research Society. Basically, a group of intellectuals that work elaborating a kind of, if you want, ideological legitimation of the regime. And Miki works there. He writes for this group and so on. So many people criticize Miki, and also in the history of Japanese and post-war Japanese philosophy, there is this kind of criticism of Miki, how he turns to the right or something like that, which has, of course, Miki has some aspects that might be problematic. What you can always, the continuity that you can find, I will say, is that he's always trying to react and he's always participating in the historical processes of his time. So, yeah, this is one of the main reasons why Miki is important for us today. He's a philosopher that has a lot to offer in terms of the practical role of philosophy, right?
No, I think you gave us such a wonderful kind of round reading of Miki's life. And now my next question is, who were Miki's philosophical influences, and how does he employ these philosophical influences throughout his wider philosophical project?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So one of the main philosophical schools, or the first tradition in which he finds himself comfortable, is Neo-Kantianism. That maybe today is not so popular as it was, but in Japan in the 20s, Neo-Kantianism was a big thing. And in fact, Miki goes to Germany in 1922, and he comes back in 1925. And the first thing, his first destiny is Heidelberg, because Heinrich Rickard was in Heidelberg. So Ricard was, so to say, the big figure or one of the big figures of Neo-Kantianism. But one of the interesting things about Ricard is that he has a philosophy of history. He tries to conceptualize a philosophy of history from the perspective of Neo-Kantian philosophy and this kind of philosophy of values. And this is something that will be very persistent in Miki, philosophy of history and the concept of history, and helps us to understand, okay, what was Miki's interest. So Ricard was one of his first big influences. And he goes to Heidelberg to study with him. This was also an interesting time because there is a very good article that talks about this. Germany had a lot of inflation during that time. The relation between the German mark and the yen at that time was very favorable for the Japanese. So many of these Japanese students or Japanese exchange scholars could actually pay for to have like private lessons from Ricker, from Gadamer, people who were around during this time. So Miki was able to have not just to meet figures like Rickard or Gadama or Carl Löwit, but also he was able to, in some cases, receive like have a kind of private lessons from these philosophers because German philosophers needed money, and the Japanese had a lot of money. There were many Japanese intellectuals going to Germany during this time. Anyway, Miki goes to Germany and feels that Rickard has actually not much to offer anymore. I mean, he was already familiar with Neo-Kantian philosophy, and the Neo-Kant and the philosophy of history of Rickard is a kind of formalistic philosophy of history. It's a philosophy of history without a real, I don't know, the substance of history, so to say. And then he finds out that there is another philosopher in Marburg who seems to be very interesting, and this is Heidegger. So Miki goes from Heidelberg to Marburg to study with Heidegger, and Heidegger, I will say, was the another big influence for Miki to understand Miki. And Heidegger, so to say, gives or offers to Miki the conceptual tools to think history from this from the point of view of facticity, from the point of view of the the experiential, if you want, right? And the third influence that is very important is, and he also kind of comes in contact with it in Europe, is Marxism. In Germany, he also meets people like Karl Mannheim, who was a popular Marxist at the time. These three influences are very important for Miki: Neo-Kantianism, Heidegger, and Marxism. But of course, also German philosophy in general, right?
Perhaps now you could discuss Miki's relation to the Kyoto School. How is his thought similar or different to other founding Kyoto School members?
Yeah. So first, let me say something about the Kyoto School. So what is this Kyoto School? Because the word, I will say, can be a little bit misleading, right? So the Kyoto School, I will say, is not a group of philosophers that share one kind of core identity. I like to talk about a kind of constellation of philosophers or a kind of network of philosophers because it's true that there are many authors, right, or intellectuals, and they share different things. They share, in some cases, they share institutional proximity because Nishida was teaching at Kyoto University. Tanabe Hajime was also teaching at Kyoto University. Miki studied at Kyoto University together with other authors that will be important for the Kyoto School, like Nishitani Keiji. in some cases they studied at Kyoto, but they don't remain in Kyoto. But I will say they also share, of course, a kind of philosophical proximity. They are influenced by Nishida and Tanabe, and there are some concepts that are important for them. For example, the concept of nothingness is important for Miki, is important for Nishitani. But also, in some cases, they are critical of the philosophy of Nishida. So many people, for example, don't include Miki in the Kyoto School. Or sometimes they say, okay, Miki is the so-called belongs to the so-called leftist Kyoto School, left-wing Kyoto School. Then you have authors like Tosaka Jun, who is a little bit younger than Miki. Also, he was close to Miki. He's much more critical of the Kyoto School, Tosaka, right? So many people don't include Tosaka in the Kyoto School, even if also student of Nishida and Tanabe and was kind of influenced, at least for by their philosophy. So yeah, having said that, so I like to think of it as a network because they read each other, they criticize each other. For Miki, Nishida is very important, especially the way Nishida has of understanding, I would say, the historical world in terms of this kind of acting intuition, this concept of acting intuition, which refers to the way in which we act in the world, not as isolated individuals, but Nishida, I think, wants to tries to say that always when we act on the world is also acting on us. This is somehow the what lies behind this idea of acting intuition. So every intuition is also an action. We are always passive and active at the same time. And this is very important for Miki. And this is important because it breaks with the a kind of unidirectional logic. The idea that either humans are a result of the environment or humans are, maybe in the sense of idealism, humans are subjects, right? The creators of the world. And I would say many authors of the Kyoto School want to find a different solution, a solution that, finds the contact point between subject and object. So in this sense, Nishida is very important for Miki. That's precisely also one of the ideas of inquiry into the good. This is the early Nishida, so to say, but Nishida there has this concept of pure experience, Junsui Keiken, and the pure experience is, so to say, the experience without a subject and without an object, right? Which is paradoxical, right? But it's a kind of pure experience in the sense that before having subject and object, for Nishida, we have a pure experience. And it's from the pure experience that subject and object emerge. And what Miki wants to add to that is history, right? Nishida later will also be interested in the concept of history, but at the beginning, history is kind of marginal for Nishida. Miki notices that and he thinks, okay, we need to put some history into Nishida. And this is also interesting to think how many authors argue that it's not just that Miki was influenced by Nishida, but to a certain extent also Nishida will be influenced by Miki, especially in this interest that Miki has for history. Relation between Nishida and Miki was very close at the beginning. Nishida actually wanted Miki to be somehow also a professor at Kyoto University, but there are some problems in the middle and this cannot happen. But Miki was somehow the favorite of Nishida. at some point. But also because of his problems with the law, he will never be able to come back to the academia as such.
I was now going to ask you about Miki's relation to German and European philosophy. And do you think there's a clear distinction between these influences from the West and and of course the philosophers of the East? And what is the distinction between the two? Because I don't really I understand he's a philosopher of Japan, but also influenced by German ideas as well too. And I don't want to just focus on the European. I also want to
Right.
focus on his own ideas. But it'd be nice to know the differences between the East and West ideas that are, percolating in his writings and in his thought.
Right. Yeah, I will say also as a difference with other Kyoto School members, Miki does not, at least so explicitly, right? Buddhist terminology, let's say, at least in the earlier stages and middle stages of his work. And in Nishida, for example, if you pick up Sen no Kenkyu, if you pick up this book from 1911, Inquiry into the Good, you find quotes from William James, but you also find quotes from Confucian authors. You find quotes from Buddhist authors and so on. So Nishida was much more active in that sense of mixing different traditions. I'm not saying that in Miki this doesn't happen, but at least Miki's not searching for that. Even if he has, I will talk about this. He this is much more clear that he tries to engage in Eastern thought. But at the beginning, right, he's more like he understands his function, I will say, much more as an interpreter of Western philosophies and also as a promoter of these new schools that are happening and are emerging in Europe, like phenomenology and existentialism. At the beginning, Miki understands his task in this sense much more as a promoter and introducer of these new philosophers and also, of course, of German idealism. So Miki is a reader of Kant, of Hegel, and of Schelling. Fichte is also important for Miki because Fichte is also a philosopher of action, right? Miki has this in his philosophy of history. So there is a book titled Philosophy of History from 1932, I think. And in philosophy of history, Miki kind of reacts to the concept of Tathandlung in Fichte with the concept of Tatsache. So Miki says something like, "Oh, the notion of Tathandlung is still very subjectivistic, right?" Um, I guess he's thinking about the I, Fichtean I. And he says we need something much more concrete, much more embodied. And he calls this Tatsache. So you have Miki actively engaging with this German tradition and also actively kind of interpreting it. Yeah, because you are also a Schellingian. So Miki was also a strange reader of Schelling. There's something very, very interesting in one of the last books that he writes, which is The Logic of the Imagination. The first part was published in 1937. We have the first full translation of a book by Miki. This was done by John Crummell. So this is The Logic of the Imagination. So in The Logic of the Imagination, which some people regard as Miki Magnus opus, in The Logic of Imagination, in one of the first chapters, Miki has a very original interpretation of the deities of Samothrace, which is a book that even Schellingians don't read, right? Miki offers already in 1937 a kind of very original interpretation of the deities, putting that in dialogue with his own philosophy. So yeah, he's a very creative author. And German philosophy is very important to him. And as I said then, for him, this search for a proper like Eastern philosophy or Japanese philosophy is not explicitly there at the beginning, at least. It is clear that he asks himself that question, right? The question, okay, is there a Japanese philosophy? Are we Japanese just importing things from the West and kind of doing philosophy in a Western style, or do we have a kind of our own conceptual toolbox? And this is also, of course, if you ask this question in the 1930s in Japan, this is also a very political question because it's related to nationalism. Because you have, of course, nationalist authors trying to push this agenda of okay, we should promote not the Western philosophy, we should promote Eastern thought or philosophy. But Miki understands this very clear. Miki understands that this question can lead to nationalism or ultranationalism. So he knows that, he's very aware of that, but he nevertheless thinks that this is an important question to ask. One of the parts of Miki's work where we can find this question is his philosophy of technology. 1940, Miki also becomes very interested in this question of technology and also in the question whether there is a Japanese technology, like not just right, not just if there are machines in Japan, right? The question is whether Japan has is able of technological thinking. And he, in fact, says, yes, we Japanese should not just import Western technology, but we should also adapt that Western technology to our own technical thought. And I think something similar happens with philosophy. So,
Thank you for all these like wonderful answers. I think you're doing such a great job of like navigating us through Miki's philosophy and his life and his thought, of course. Um, this is a completely off the cuff question. How is Miki's thought now understood in Japanese philosophical circles? Is he embraced? Is he welcomed? Or is his relation maybe with the right and militarized area in 1945 Japan? Is that seen as how we in the West view Heidegger's terrible stint
right.
with Nazism? Is he embraced? Is he a little to the side, marginalized? How is he seen in Japanese philosophical circles?
Yeah, I think that happened. That kind of negative perception of Miki was there, especially in the 1980s. Nowadays, right now, I will say there is a kind of revival of Miki. I mean, of course, now in the West we have this new English translation, but also recently this book that I mentioned, The Logic of the Imagination, was also re-edited in Japan. There are some collections of essays also appeared very recently. And we are actually also 80 years after Nishida's death. 1945, but this is also then the 80 years after Miki's death. Nishida and Miki die in the same year. right at the end of the Second War. So I will say right now the perception of people is getting more interested in me in Miki. Um, if you compare Miki and Nishida or Miki and Tanabe or Miki and Nishitani, especially Nishida and Tanabe, they are attempting to have a system, I will say, somehow. They are they are systematic thinkers. They have a project of a system, right? And Miki does not have a project of system so clear. You can reconstruct a kind of the philosophy of Miki, but Miki is not a systematic philosopher in the same sense that Nishida and Tanabe, that they are reformulating their own system over and over again. So that's an important difference, and that's also helpful to understand Miki because, as I said, then Miki is an activist, if you want. So Miki is more interested in reacting to his context. In that sense, his philosophy might not be so appealing if you're looking for a systematic thinker, but he's very useful to think about contemporary issues because he writes about propaganda, he writes about fascism, he writes about kind of the figure of the leader, uh, about what today we will say about populism, right? He writes about the role of technology in the society. He writes about, in fact, he when he was working as a commentator in the newspapers, basically his column, his section in the newspaper was reacting to these contemporary issues. So it's a philosopher that is very close to us in that sense, and I think people are starting to see that. And of course, this doesn't mean that we should not uh, inquire into his relation with the power, right? One thing does not exclude the other, I would say.
It's interesting that Marx spent some time as a journalist as well too. It's interesting. A lot of philosophers, I think Walter Benjamin also did some work in journalism as well too. It's so
Right.
interesting that there's a lot of philosophers that have done this, that didn't have access to academia or didn't have academic jobs. So we're at that hour mark, and I have one last question for you, which is more directly towards your own research and towards your own work. So, why is Miki's philosophical thought interesting to you? And what are some of the areas of his thought that attracted you to his philosophy?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I didn't go into his main concepts, but he has one interesting text in that he publishes in 1928 titled The Marxist Form of Anthropology. The Marxist Form of Anthropology. And basically, he uh, explains the title is kind of also misleading, but what he tries to do there is to, I will say, kind of explain the idea of ideology and this classic Marxist idea of ideology and infrastructure in terms of existential philosophy. So, right, usually the orthodox idea will be that okay, there are some material conditions of existence, and these material conditions of existence or forms of production produce our ideology, right? Produce our systems of thought. Um, this is a kind of linear way to understand this relation. And Miki wants to say, no, like when we of this material world and in the middle of these forms of production should not be thought in terms of a kind of deterministic, but in an existential way. So the fact that we exist in the world, and this is where Heidegger comes, where the essence of humans is being thrown into the world. So he, instead of having this very static level at the bottom, he talks about this concept of basic experience or fundamental experience, Kisokeiken in Japanese. Heidegger talks about Grunderfahrung. So you can either, I like to translate it as a basic experience, but maybe if you think about Heidegger, you should translate it as fundamental experience. Anyway, Miki says, start from this fundamental experience, which is the experience of existing in the middle of things and existing with other people. Um, And this is the starting point to think about ideology, not just in terms of our material conditions influencing our idea or our worldviews, for example, but also uh, how this our worldviews then come back and also influence our material conditions. So I was very interested in this idea of understanding ideology in a more dynamic way. And for me, this was also useful to think about political myths because Miki was, as I said, very interested in how propaganda works, but also he was very interested in the idea of political myth that he takes from people like Sorel, Jacques Sorel, right? This French syndicalist who says that sometimes for a political movement to emerge, it is more useful to have a myth. And a myth is an emotional image, if you want, something that is able to connect many people emotionally and not intellectually. You can have a slogan, an intellectual slogan, and trying to convince people rationally. But if you really want to generate that kind of social movement, this is what Sorel says, it is more effective to have a myth. And a myth, in that sense, is irrational, emerges from the, so to say, the people themselves. And this is, Miki takes this and thinks this in the context of Japan, where political myths were emerging, right? The idea of a Japanese culture, the idea of a Japaneseness, the idea of a Japanese singularity, right? What is particular to the Japanese? These were discourses that were circulating a lot during this time, and Miki uses this to think how ideology influences material conditions, influence the ideology in a very dynamic way. So this was the focus of my research.
And I should have stated at the beginning of the video that you have multiple publications on different thinkers, especially on Schelling as well, who's one of my great loves. Can I just ask you one final question? You
Sure.
said if you could explain maybe one or two concepts, main concepts of Mickey's, which concepts would you choose to bring as an introduction to Mickey's philosophy?
Right. So I mentioned this idea of basic experience. Miki stops using the word basic experience, but then he uses another term, which is pathos. And and he uses this term always in relation with another term, which is logos, right? Pathos and logos. So somehow what he said about basic experience and ideology in the late 20s, he will reformulate it as pathos and logos. And pathos and logos is this idea comes over and over again in Miki. And everything in Miki, we could say, is a result of a dialectic between pathos and logos. Pathos is the this emotional, existential, but also embodied. This is very important for Miki. Dimension of human existence, and logos is the structured, discursive, and rational level of existence. And what is interesting in Miki is that this, it seems to me that this dialectic never stops. So it's a continuous struggle and movement between pathos and logos. So yeah, pathos and logos is very important for Miki. Also, and this also helps us to understand this and this other very important concept, which is imagination. So I mentioned this book, The Logic of the Imagination. Imagination is, you can say, is okay, it's what mediates between pathos and logos at the end, right? It's this middle faculty. And Miki then becomes, especially the late Miki, is very interested in this aspect of reality. And you can see how, for Miki, the moment of concretization is very important, right? You cannot remain at the level of abstraction, you cannot remain at the level of irrationality. You have to, everything should be concrete at the end. It's about action, it's about realization. Imagination for Miki is the production of forms. Form, on the other hand, is also a term that was important for Nishida. Nishida talks about the formless form, katachi naki katachi, the formless form. And Miki again tries to think this topic within the historical world, right? So it's about the realization and the production of forms. He says technology is also about kind of producing forms. So yeah, pathos and logos are for sure two very important concepts for Miki, maybe two of the main concepts of Miki's philosophy.
Well, Dr. Wirtz, I want to thank you so much for this really, really thoughtful and in-depth, um, navigation through Miki's philosophy, his life. You've done such a wonderful job of bringing to flesh Miki's thoughts, so I can't thank you enough. And also for participating in this series. It's wonderful to have you a part of it.
No, thank you again, and I hope it was understandable and useful somehow.
Oh, it was definitely useful and, of course, understandable.
Okay, thank you a lot.